Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to look at William Wordsworth. I believe there is not a single person who is not familiar with Wordsworth. You should have read him, all his major poems like Michael or Lucy Gray poems or all those poems, or even should at least should have come across Daffodils or Solitary Reaper, yeah, or the Rainbow poem, or the yes, of course, the ode on the or his ode, his very famous ode. Wordsworth is not someone you can disregard when it comes to poetry, discussion on poetry. But today we are going to look at him as a critic, literary critic. The occasion and limitation of his critical work. I say occasion because it was only once did he write any criticism, or you could say that one book that was enlarged or revised periodically. Okay. Considered to be the pioneer of Romantic poetry and Romantic criticism, his criticism evolved out of his need to defend his poetry and has since been regarded as the most representative of Romantic criticism. See, he is considered to be the pioneer of Romantic poetry. He started off the trend of Romantic poetry. Well, that would not exactly be right because before him there was Thomas Chatterton who laid the foundation for Romanticism in England. But since Chatterton didn't live long enough to make any, contribute very largely to this movement, except for having become a cult figure, sort of, this the credit for romanticism as such, the romantic movement as such goes to Wordsworth. So his criticism mainly evolved out of his need to defend his poetry, in the sense he wrote this along with his friend Coleridge. He wrote this book called Lyrical Ballads, which had quite a few poems in them. So it was a collaborative work, but yes, even though they were supposed to have equally shared, okay, should have equally contributed to the making of the book, Coleridge contributed only 4 poems, whereas the rest were all written by Wordsworth himself. So this Lyrical Ballads, in this particular book, what Wordsworth does is he writes in a very simple language, focusing on very simple day-to-day situations. Okay, so he does not go for any lofty or very high topics to deal with, nor any very lofty words of choice, choice of words. Okay, so what you see is because see, you have to also remember that the Romantic age immediately followed the Neoclassical age. Of course there are the pre-romantics in between, but it was a very it was a stage of trans in motion. You could say that it was a very short period in which the pre-romantics thrived. It immediately turned into Romanticism. So the new classics who were writing in the Quarterly Review and the Edinburgh Review, these writers, these critics, basically attacked this book, Lyrical Ballads. Okay, they attacked the kind of poetry written in Lyrical Ballads. Now Wordsworth, he had to somehow defend his choice of topics, his style, his choice of poetic diction, all of it he wanted to defend. So in around 1800, he came up with another edition of Lyrical Ballads, to which he attached a preface. Now this preface is what became his main critical work as such, which he later on, once again, he revised in 1802, and then again later on, maybe in 1815. He did keep periodically revising it and adding, kept attaching some appendix to it or some extra essay to it. But then that is the main book that he wrote on criticism. So all of his critical ideas belong to that one particular book. Okay, so it is limited. His critical work is limited. So Wordsworth's critical works comprise of his preface alone, that seems to have gone numerous revisions, so much so that they border on hypothetical postulations than providing any practical solution to the neoclassical verbosity. So what you see is after numerous revision, I mean, see, when you are, immediately defending yourself, you tend to be very defensive. Defensive as in you immediately say outright anything to ward off the attack on you, right? But then, after cool contemplation, you tend to realize the mistakes you made in your defense, right? It always happens. Someone accuses us of something, right? Imagine when someone accuses you of something, of having done something. What you do is your immediate reaction is defense, right? You become defensive. And while we are becoming defensive illogically, I have to say this word illogically here, because when we are in a heightened emotional state, we tend to be illogical. So when we are defensive, we are in a very very emotional. Okay, so we tend to say things that we do not actually mean, or that does not have any have any grounding. Yeah. So only after a while do we realize the mistakes we make. Then we may not have the choice of revising it. But fortunately for Wordsworth, he kept revising it so long. He kept realizing the flaws, or after after he wrote this one book, there were questions based on those books. The other critics questioned his his theories. So he had to keep revising his work, and ultimately, what you see is a lot of hypothetical postulations than providing any practical solutions. See, look at this sentence: border on hypothetical postulations than providing any practical solution to the neoclassical verbosity. So the main idea was somehow lost. Okay, it was more theoretical than practical, than giving us any practical solutions to neoclassical verbosity, as in how the neoclassics were more intent on having wit. Okay, wit for as the basis of good poetry, or as the qualifying factor of a good poetry. Wordsworth could not give any practical solutions, only hypothetical postulations, only theoretical ideas. All right. So before we move on to further analyzing Wordsworth's criticism, you have to understand that whatever he wrote was a mark of the age he lived in, right? So he lived in this romantic age, and we need to understand what romanticism is first. Now, romantic movement, what do you call it? It's not it is an historical event, but as most historical events go, it does not belong to any kind of revolution or some war or something. It is a product of revolution, French Revolution, of course, because see, it is a continental phenomenon that and had its seeds in the French Revolution, the basic tenets of which were liberty, equality, and fraternity. So these were the main philosophies behind, the French Revolution, and this French Revolution sort of gave ground to the Romantic movement in Europe, which spread to other parts of the world, first to England, actually. So it is this Romanticism itself is merely a mindset. Okay, it's a mindset. It's a way of feeling, which started in Western Europe in around 18th, like in the middle of the 18th century, possibly. So artists, philosophers, poets, it affected everyone. So you could see Romanticism growing in all of those people, the artists, poets, and philosophers. They basically concerned themselves with nature, children, love, money, work, everything. So, in some aspects, our sensibilities are romantic in some way. So you could say that this romanticism, this romantic movement, altered the way we thought and perceived the world. And still today, you find all these romantic heroes in movies, right? So, have you ever wondered what this romantic heroes? Why are they called romantic as such? Because they rely more on emotion, instinct, and impulse rather than logic and reason, right? Okay. in some aspects of our sensibilities, we're all romantics. Because we tend to appreciate all these romance movies and romance novels, right? Romanticism is best understood as a reaction, to the birth of the modern world and some of its key features like industrialization or urbanization, secularization, or even consumerism. So when these things came into being, romanticism was an automatic response from those who saw how cold-hearted, how how tedious the life was going to be away from nature. Because with the advent of industrialization, with the advent of urbanization, what happened? All the natural scenery was being demolished. It was being converted into bare plains where brick and mortar structures came into being overnight, right? So the romantics, they realized the world that they were losing right in front of their eyes. So there was this one Swiss philosopher, we've already spoken about him plenty of times, I believe, Rosso. Now, this philosopher wrote a book, okay, Emile, or on education. Now, it contains diatribes against the oppressive world of adults. Now, it praises the natural goodness, the spontaneity, and wisdom of little children. It is at points extremely anxious and get, oh, and you worry about how Rosso is seen as growing ever more, the world. He sees how the world around Rosso is, himself is growing uh, rational or scientific and technologically based. It is increasingly sensible and planned and sterile and bureaucratic. Against all of these, Rousseau emphasizes the child. Okay, in his book on education, he emphasizes that the child is the original rebel. Okay, as in the child is something. I mean, you see the children always rebelling, right? Rebelling against everything that constrains them, that disciplines them, right? So he believes, or at least he wants us to believe, that the child is the original rebel, and the representative of everything that is pure, or unschooled, and he is the seat of creativity and genius. For the first time in Western history, glamour is directed not at the attainment of reason and adult self control, but at the freedom from tradition and the natural innocence and the sweetness of the child. So, before this, the child was merely relegated to the sidelines. The children were not given any importance. They were treated as something that only should be taken in small measures. They were just put into the nursery, and they were just taken care of by the maids and the ayahs. The rest of the time, the parents had no contact with the children at all, except for occasionally visiting them to the nursery. So there was a sea change in the way people started looking at the child itself. Okay, now see, now romanticism itself is not merely an idea, is not merely a single idea. Okay, it is constitutive of all the ideas that are free and independent of constraints and disciplines, or that is that is free of reason and logic to some extent, but still can be reasoned out. So you see, for the first time in Western history, glamour is directed not at the attainment of reason and adult self-control, but at the freedom from tradition and the natural innocence and the sweetness of the child, right? So we spoke about how Thomas Chatterton in England, he himself became a cult figure, as in he could not, he was a very frail, beautiful person of around a 17-year old poet he was, who poisoned himself because he could not contend with the family pressure, which were expecting him to become a lawyer. Now, a cult had formed around this beautiful boy, beautiful young poet, and he became the emblem for the idea of sensitive, doomed person, often an artist rejected by the vulgar world, right? This course in vulgar world that is not appreciating a beautiful, sensitive artist. So see, whenever we speak of a Byronic hero, you can easily imagine Chatterton being the you know inspiration behind it, right? So you could say that Chatterton influenced all the romantics that followed him later, including Byron, Keats, Van Gogh, and even today, if you think of all the movies that are being produced in the film houses, or the songs that you hear, they are all somehow they all of them have somehow been inspired by Chatterton's image. So Romanticism borrows mainly, you could say, it borrows from Christianity. A kind of secularized Christ-like figure is behind the romantic hero. When we speak of romantic hero, he is sorely abused, grossly abused by the society, and the society is neglectful of his genius, of his importance. Okay, just like Christ. At least that's the idea behind this romantic hero. At least we feel there is a great connection between the two. Okay, so when Wordsworth, with his sister Dorothy, went to Grasmere in the Lake District around 1799, which where he took up this very famous cottage called Dove Cottage, which went down in history for because that's where he wrote some of his most famous poetry. He lived there for about 9 years, and this Lake District inspired Wordsworth like no other. And he had such wonderful company in his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, and his friend, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So these three spent hours and hours, or days and nights talking about nature, discussing nature, and what kind of poetry should be written, what form, what style should be taken into account, and who should it appeal to, and what should it appeal to, with the intellect or with a reason, logic, or heart, or emotion. All of these topics they discussed and came up with so many beautiful poems. Both Wordsworth and Coleridge came up. Coleridge was more slack in writing, creating poetry, but whenever he did create, he created wonderful poetry. Anyway, so why we need to discuss all of this is because whenever there is a kind of abstract, romanticism itself is seen as an abstract concept, but it is not. It has different, it has many components inside it, nevertheless. So you see, there are times, say for instance, Goethe. He speaks of how it limits of reason and power of irrational over human fragile mind would be again a romantic intent, okay, a romantic concept. That is, Goethe believes that our reason is limited, of course, and but the power of irrational, okay, the power of irrational over humans fragile over reason itself is unconscious but nevertheless there, very much there. To be romantic, according to Goethe, is to have a sympathy for madness and to kill an almost vengeful attitude towards bombastic claims as to the triumph of rationality, science, and logic. So, in Wordsworth poetry, what you see is a kind of celebration of something that is very much under threat. The natural world, daffodils, clouds, all the rustic scenes, rainbows, butterflies, rivers. When you look at Wordsworth's poetry, there would always be mention of only nature, maximum. So, and even if humans appear, they are set as in contrast to nature, not exactly on par with nature, right? they're made to seem insignificant when compared to nature. So running through Wordsworth poetry, what you see is a certain hatred for everything that is mechanical and industrial. So according to Wordsworth, to be a romantic is to take the side of nature against industry. Okay, he believes that his belief as a romantic is to take the side of nature. To be romantic is to find relief from the competitive city life. In the As the world grows ever more technological and rational, romanticism has come to stick up for the irrational, the untrained, the exotic, the childlike, and the naive. There is something a bit adolescent and immature within romanticism, of course, but then again, there can be something rather heartless, cold, and dogmatic, and arrogant in many aspects of modernity. So it changed the perception of and common man became the epicenter of the social fabric. You could say, in terms of social fabric, common man became the epicenter, whereas at large it was nature. Nature took up the entire space and man was sent to the periphery. Now, the terminology. So, you can very well imagine that Wordsworth did not call himself a romantic. The coinage came later. So, it was Carlyle who first used the terms romantic, romanticism, and romanticist with reference to Germans. So, some of the key figures of the Romantic movement, there's, of course, we spoke of Rosso. Rosso, the French philosopher whose works were based on individual freedom and autonomy. We saw how he challenged that all that was right only because it was established. So he voiced out against royal absolutism, aristocratic privilege, religious dogmatism, and other abuse of authority that interfered with the natural rights and liberty of man. Now, in the political sphere, these ideas culminated in the French Revolution, with, of course, the idea of liberty, fraternity, and equality, as we've discussed earlier. In the literary, they gave rise to the Romantic movement, with its stress on individuality and impatience with the arbitrary edicts of legislators. So, in the political scene, what you see is his ideas ended in French Revolution, of course, and in literary field, what you see is a certain angst, certain impatience against against the arbitrary edicts of legislators. Arbitrary edicts of legislators in the sense he defied rules and conventions. He wanted, even in literature, to break free of all the rules that constrain the human impulse, human mind. Right. So what you see is there are the Schlegel brothers, and again Schelling, I believe, I don't know how to pronounce it, so forgive me if I'm wrong in my pronunciation. In particular, propagated the romantic view of art, that it seemed to affect that it soon affected the course of criticism in the rest of Europe. So these brothers who are Germans, they brought in certain romantic concepts that became popular all over Europe. So, according to one of the brothers, August Wilhelm, what you see is he sees romanticism as a secret longing for the chaos that underlies creation and strives for ever new births. He stressed the role of imagination in art. So, to him, classicism was orderly. Okay, classicism was something that was disciplined, whereas romanticism was chaos. Okay, that it was a longing for the chaos, because see, what the classics showed was that there has to be unity everywhere. Unity of action, unity of time, unity of place, everything has to be unified. The world scene has to be unified, and the poetry or any literature that imitates the world has to show that unity, has to profess that unity in it, right? But romanticism, whereas but romanticism, whereas the Schlegel brothers are concerned, they believe that it shows a certain longing for the chaos. There is order, there is unity, there is disunity, right? Order and chaos that exist under the order. Okay, see, whatever there is outside, for instance, to use a very simple analogy, when you are excited, you do not, I mean, you may be excited in your heart, but just imagine you're winning a prize. You're quite excited, yeah, but on the surface you show your calm, right? You tend to behave very gracefully. You do not jump with joy in front of your teachers, right? I mean, you're allowed to, but my point is that there is a whole lot of exuberance, there is a whole lot of excitement. It is utter chaos inside. Your impulse tells you to do something, okay, but your discipline, the order with which you have been trained, you're trained not to reveal that chaos, right? So the same goes for all the occasions that we face. We may feel sorrow, we may feel extremely down, but then we are trained to curb that enthusiasm, or curb any passionate display of emotion, right? So see, romanticism seeks that passion, that impulse, okay. I hope you must have acquired some understanding of what romanticism, because I've given you so many different points of view of what romanticism meant, okay. Please go through the entire video once again so that you get glimpses of it in whatever I have said so far. So it is a secret longing for the chaos, please. This is the operative word here, chaos. Do remember it. That underlies creation and strives for ever new births. It strives for further chaos. It strives for more passion. Okay. They stress the role of imagination in art. Again, William Godwin in Britain. So William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. I believe you're familiar with them both. So Godwin wrote on political justice and reform, while Mary Wollstonecraft wrote on the vindication of rights of women. So these were, I mean, we could go at length and talk about Godwin and Wollstonecraft, because they are those kind of figures, but we'll save it for another day. Yeah. So these were the main key figures of the Romantic movement. Now coming to his poetry, I have mentioned only very few poems here. The Immortality Ode, Tintern Abbey, the Solitary by Lucy poems, Michael, the Tablestone, Recluse. Well, he did not finish Recluse. It was published as The Excursion. Only one part was written in all of his 40 years. And the Prelude. Of course, there are plenty of other poems that, that are brilliant in execution. But these were the most important ones. As far as his critical works are concerned, as I said, he wrote one main work, Preface to Lyrical Ballads. It's basically not lyrical ballads as such, the preface, okay, the preface to his book called Lyrical Ballads, which he first wrote in 1800 and then revised in 1802. Then Essay upon Epitaphs in 3 parts in 1810, Preface to the Excursion, Preface to the Poems. All of these were prefaces, merely prefaces that he built upon gradually. Okay. Now, his lyrical ballads, which came up in which he wrote in which were published in 1798, had this main preface in 1800, and an appendix came up with alongside the preface in 1802, and an essay supplementary in 1815. Where as his neoclassical poetic, okay, not his, to further see how romanticism was born, we need to see what gave birth to it. See, it's like a chicken egg theory once again. So you have to look at the neoclassical poetic diction to figure out why Wordsworth seemed to have developed the kind of aversion to verbosity. What brought in the verbosity in poetry? Because see, what we see in Alexander Pope's poetry is brilliant wit, imagination, reason, logic, morality, all brought together to create this one fantastic series of poems. But in the hands of lesser writers, the idea of wit itself was reduced to verbosity. Verbosity would simply mean and simply babbling or using unnecessary words. Words do not contribute to the making of meaning. Okay, so I believe I have taken enough time already, and if we started this, it'll take some more time. So yes, we'll stop here and inshallah hopefully continue in the next class. So far, thank you. Stay safe. Assalamu alaikum.